Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Maggie Bartlett, welcome back to Public Health on Call.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm so excited to be here.
Really good to see you. Maggie is a virologist and a co-host of Why Should I Trust You podcast, and today we're here to talk about sneaky viruses.
Yes, one of my favorite topics. I'm so pleased that you reached out for this.
Would you tell us why it's one of your favorite topics?
Yeah, so honestly, I think the scariest viruses are the ones that you think you've survived, but hang around. And there's tons of examples of that. And I don't think that it gets nearly the attention as like the acute, the pandemic viruses, which I also have a passion for. But it's this piece of, I think, pandemic preparedness that we don't really appreciate is what happens after. Long COVID is a great example of that. There are still millions who are suffering. We're still trying to figure out the mechanisms, but for some it is persistent virus. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. We'd been looking at this. The first publication, I think, was in the 50s, but back to the first outbreaks and pandemics, there was a portion of people who didn't recover. And there's another portion of people who look like they recover, but the virus is hiding somewhere, and it comes back 5 to 10 years later. And that becomes a really devastating presentation.
So they can like disappear into your body somewhere and hide out. Like, how does this work?
Yeah, so viruses are very sneaky, right? So they can go all over your body. We can test it in your blood because there's enough viral particles swimming around that we can pick them up. But once they go into like a privileged space, an immune privileged space, like the brain, we're no longer able to see them there. But that doesn't mean they're not. There's a ton of great examples of persistent viruses that we don't really pay a lot of attention to. Epstein-Barr virus being one, herpes viruses. These are in the latent category. So we know that people get them and then they hang out in your lymph node or maybe peripheral nerves, and then they can recrudesce later in life. There are other viruses where it's not their main mode, but they can still do that. Measles is a great example. So it can get to the brain, and in order to hide from the immune system, it starts to slow down. And so it doesn't actually go away, it's just hiding. And then over time, it can start to come back up. If there's some other trigger, if there's something that shifts your immune system, the virus can recrudesce and cause really severe encephalitis, and it happens so fast. Most parents who have a child who have this say they were fine and then they weren't. So there's this limit of detection that I think kind of underscores this, especially for a lot of viruses, that it's not their main mode of action. It's kind of happening by accident, but in enough people that it's a real concern.
And there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, but I want to start with use the term immune privileged space.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so there are a good number of immune privileged spaces, the brain being one. It just means that your immune system is working differently there. I kind of like immune specialized instead because it's not that there's no immunity. The brain is a great example. You wouldn't want the same immune system in your brain as everywhere else in the body because your neurons are not renewable. And so in the rest of your body, if a cell's infected, you want your cells to kill that cell, to get rid of the infection. You don't want that in your brain. You want a different tact. And so there's a whole different beautiful immune system in our brain. There are several other places. Our lymph node has a very specific immune response. Germinal tissues have special immune responses. That's why we see persistence of things like Ebola and Zika in semen. And that's another really interesting piece of this. And you see it in places like the eye. So there are all these places that viruses can get to and then hide for a period of time and then come back.
And do we know how long they can hide there? And then what makes them come back? What triggers that?
So this is a fascinating question. I think what's so interesting about like filoviruses like Ebola is in the first cases of its sibling virus, Marburg. When that was spreading, there was a case of sexual transmission during the initial outbreak. We didn't get concrete data for the fact that filoviruses do this until the 2014 Ebola outbreak. And we know that the virus can persist in those spaces for up to a year, possibly longer. For measles, we know that it's typically 5 to 10 years. There are a few reasons for that. So if you're infected when you're a child, your immune system's changing as you age. We don't really know the trigger of what's called subsclerosing panencephalitis. That's the recrudescence of measles that's been hiding in the brain. Partially because we had kind of controlled that with vaccination. So the rates of you getting that became 2 in 10,000 to 4 in 100,000, which is miraculous. And so we didn't have a lot of understanding, but it could be your immune system is looking at another virus. So your immune system changes enough that the virus feels like it can come back out. You could be exposed to a toxin. Again, your immune system could shift. Stress changes your immune system. There are a lot of these different variables that we really haven't parsed. And I think that's what's also so interesting to me about this question of, chronic disease lately. Measles being a key indicator of there's a chronic condition that can happen that we can fully prevent. And that's just one of many. Most viruses now we've shown whether they cause a cancer later in life or one of these neurological sequelae, vaccines prevent those from ever happening, which is incredible.
One of the questions I had for you is what is the difference between a virus later flaring up versus a complication? So, for example, we've been reading in the news recently about the monovirus. There's a link there to MS. That seems like a completely different condition versus something like you had maybe chickenpox when you were little and then you get shingles when you're older, which seems a little bit more similar. So what's the difference there?
Yeah, so I think what's also interesting is there's a spectrum, right? So it can be directly caused by the virus, directly caused by the damage that the virus caused in that acute stage. So you think about that with persistent dysautonomias where your immune system and your system itself is compromised after that initial infection. And then you have autoimmune conditions that are triggered because of some sort of molecular mimicry. Something in us looks enough like the virus that virus triggered your immune system to then start attacking things like myelin in the case of MS, and causing that sequential disease. For persistent infections or things like chickenpox, where they ultimately go to your peripheral nerves, everybody gets chickenpox as a kid if they were born before the vaccine. And the main consideration is that when you're over 50, you might get vaccinated for shingles because it can come back out. But there's interesting data that there's a growing number of people that actually have this post-chickenpox neuralgia from the initial infection because it's attacking those nerves. It's still doing damage. It's just so slow that it wasn't fully appreciated before. And like I said, I think all of these post-viral syndromes, post-acute infectious syndromes are really kind of ignored by the medical system because the diagnostic tests aren't there to meet the moment. I think about ME/CFS, myalgic encephalitic chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic Lyme, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. All of these different flavors can be caused by different viruses because of the type of cells that are being infected and changed over time. And so I think that that's an important piece that we can't lose sight of. It's not just in this cohort of people, it's viruses, but it could be viruses that trigger an immune response, or it could be a complex of a multi-hit. There's a virus, there's a bacteria, there's another inciting trigger. People are complex, and so is their health conditions.
Yeah, and when you say that there's not great diagnostics for a lot of these things, that immediately triggers a thought in my mind that we don't really know the scope of the problem then. So there could be a lot of things out there, a lot of people that are suffering that may not know they have these things.
Oh, without a doubt. I think that comes up more and more, and has been a real frustration of mine because I've been someone who's had these tests. And so, especially in people who have hypermobility syndrome, so Ehlers-Danlos, which is something that I focus on, your immune responses can be changed. And so you might look like you're negative to a pathogen because our standard diagnostic is an ELISA, looking at an antibody to a pathogen. That doesn't mean the pathogen's not there. It means you don't have an antibody to that pathogen. And in those cases, it's really important that they have a diagnostician who knows to do the PCR test or the antigen test if it exists. But more and more for those chronic cases, you're probably on a long diagnostic journey to begin with, going from many different specialists. And so there needs to be a little bit of a more understanding. And I think long COVID really underscored that. That was the first time we had a diagnostic for an acute infection and a number of people who were suffering from chronic conditions. But even that, we don't have a clear diagnostic for long COVID. We do know that virus persists in a certain number of people, typically in the gut. And so people are working on making these new, nuanced diagnostics. But it's so far behind what we think of should exist in the medical system.
So is there sort of a spectrum of how dangerous these viruses, so a simpler virus like maybe a flu virus versus Ebola.
Yeah, right, okay.
So if that's the spectrum, and then you're saying, and some of these things are you can vaccinate against them and you can prevent them from happening. What are the more serious ones you know about that we can't really prevent and that maybe deserve a little more attention?
Yeah, I love that question. So I will say in influenza, it's 5 to 10% of people who have that acute infection that end up with some sort of prolonged sequelae. So I think it's also one of those that's underseen and underserved. And in Ebola, depending on the variant, it's 20 to 70% of people who survive that horrific hemorrhagic fever have long-term symptoms. And that goes back to the question of, is it because the virus is staying around or because of that immediate damage that happened right after? I think about chikungunya virus, which does have a couple of vaccines in the pipeline, but about 25% of people who have the acute infection have chronic debilitating arthralgia, so their joints are just in such pain, they're disabled. And similarly, we don't have an understanding of any emerging arbovirus or a poosh virus being one example that we've seen come back in large numbers in Brazil.
Well, I want to tap into your experience since we have you here. You're
Sure.
not just a virologist. You're also on this podcast where you're having these big conversations with MAHA people, and one of those themes has to do with chronic disease and disability. But part of what we're talking about here is that some of these things are vaccine preventable. So how do you bring those conversations together?
Oh man, I'm so grateful I have co-hosts that help me do that, because for me it's so personal. I also have a post-viral syndrome. I know it could have been prevented by a vaccine. And so I have a lot of empathy for what people are going through and what they ascribe to vaccines. And time again, when we have these conversations and they're sharing these personal journeys of, well, here's what I was tested for, here's what they said, but then I found this information online and I'm pretty positive it was this vaccine. But in that walkthrough, they said things like, and I had a shingles rash, and I had, pain right afterwards that never really went away. but it happened within, a few months of the vaccine. And so that anecdotal piece has become really interesting to me to try to break apart. And I didn't previously always bring up my health condition, but I think that it's something that has opened my eyes, especially on the podcast, of that's what a lot of people are frustrated with, is their own journey, and they're finding information out there that has led them down one path. What really draws me to this is, vaccine preventable diseases. They prevent the acute disease or hospitalization or whatever the metric is, but they also are preventing these long-term syndromes from HPV vaccines preventing cancer. We're seeing the chickenpox vaccine being shown to prevent dementia later in life. And so I think we don't fully appreciate the long-term consequences of any of these viruses. If they don't have a high mortality rate in the acute phase, we kind of shrug them off. All right, you're going to get that and you'll move on to the next. But you think about noroviruses, which we all get, and it's the worst. And we kind of treat them like they're no big deal. But in a lot of people, that's kind of the onset virus trigger before dysautonomia, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And so it becomes an interesting question of people are predisposed. They have no idea. They're not, I think, walking around knowing that this acute infection could change their life forever.
Right. Well, Maggie Bartlett, I could talk to you about this all day, but we are trying to limit it to a podcast. Thank you so much for everything. It is good to see you again, and we will continue to check back in with you on these conversations.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me, Lindsay.